Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That limitless credit as an individual would be an interesting concept. Can I go, something I've often wanted to ask, and if our the two trading partners that actually buy most of our debt, which is China and Japan, what happens, what sort of cascading effect at all is there if, let's say Japan right now, you know, bless them with their disasters and things they're facing, begins to have fairly substantial steps up in inflation, or we were seeing regionally rather aggressive inflation in areas of China. What potentially does that do in our inflation indexes? And could we actually start from the right and go left?
I think the big, the big danger is that if Japan needs extra imports and so on as their economy slows down in reaction to this disaster, and they begin to offload American reserves of American currency, which are actually government securities, and there could be a cascading effect as this puts downward pressure on the U.S. dollar, and China does the same thing, then we're at the situation where there's the only thing that the U.S. government can do to finance its deficits is to borrow from the American people.
Well,
so,
but that's also our bond prices functioning, start having move up to be able to sell the product. That was actually going to be my second half of my question, but even just, let's say there was just a national inflation step-ups within Japan and China. What do you see from just that, you know, in the price of the products being imported and exported?
Well, to the extent that China keeps fixed exchange rates with us, their prices would actually become higher in relation to us, and we'd actually have an increase in our exports and a decrease in imports from China. So for mercantilists, that would sort of be a good thing. So given that the system of exchange rates that we have today, there would not be a huge impact on the U.S. price level of those developments. Although the problems in Japan, if their economy slows down, that would put an upward tick on world prices, and there would be some effect on consumer prices here in the U.S.
Okay. Agreed.
No, I appreciate brevity.
Agreed, Congressman.
Okay, now going back the other direction, what if we actually start to see a nation of China, which is our second biggest buyer of our debt, now they have to start to begin to finance their own reconstruction, so they no longer are participating as much in the U.S. debt markets. So now we have lost one of our customers, so we start to tick up our own bond rates. What do we face?
Do we go from right to left? There are two, at least two alternatives. One would be that despite Japan not absorbing U.S. dollars in exchange for exports and then adding them to their official reserves, that other emerging countries who have absorbed enormous amounts of dollars in their banking systems and then into their official reserves, which have risen even more dramatically than Japan in the last 10 years, that they too would absorb whatever Japan no longer absorbs. I might add that Japan had been out of the market for absorbing U.S. dollars and then investing them in U.S. government securities in custody at the Fed for a good long while until recently, as the yen strengthened, and they of course wanted to lower its value in order to maintain their valued export industries. The other possibility is that there were no other emerging country or major country willing to absorb the residual of the securities, and were the United States balance of payments to remain the same, all fairly large assumptions, the dollar would then fall on the foreign exchanges. Until there was intervention by countries who did not want the dollar to become increasingly competitive in the export markets, or until the Federal Reserve reduced the volume of credit they were issuing in the market, especially the subsidizing of banks and the U.S. Treasury and deficit. For a concrete example of that, that is exactly what Paul Volcker did in 1981, 1982. He imposed the most draconian credit contraction in American history since the Great Depression, or at least comparatively with all other recessions. He put the Fed funds rate up to 20%. The prime rate hit 21%. Unemployment in New York State, Jimmy referred to in 1982, which was my year on the campaign. The unemployment rate in New York hit 11.2%. The unemployment rate nationally in 1982 under the Volcker credit contraction policy hit almost 11% nationally, higher than at any time during this so-called Great Recession. So that these two options, namely a great fall in the dollar with no residual buyer of excess foreign dollars in the foreign exchange markets, combined with Federal Reserve contraction, presents us with two unattractive alternatives.
Mr. Chairman, without any objection, can I have another 60 seconds? Please.
Briefly, the more birthday candles I blow out, the less certain I am about cause and effect with respect to bond prices and interest rates. Paradox seems to govern many of these markets. For example, the difficulties, the tragedy in Japan has forced the yen not downward, but upward as the Japanese repatriate assets from abroad to finance the holes in their income statements and balance sheets. To attempt to suppress the rise in the yen, the Japanese buy more dollars. They help to finance our deficit, even in the midst of their travail. And, you know, our interest rates have been going down since 1981. For 30 years, bond prices sensibly have been rising and interest rates falling. I think probably that no matter what happens with respect to the dollar, no matter what happens with regard to these hearings or with the congressional approach to monetary policy, chances are that the next 30 years we see more likely interest rates rising than falling. Interest rates have tended to rise and fall in generation-length intervals since the late 19th century.
Foreign confidence in the dollar is precarious, so that if there is a drop in the dollar as the foreign demand for the dollar falls, I think what you're going to see is a cascading effect. I mean, there's already talk among China and Brazil and the president of the IMF of moving towards a sort of a gold-based reserve currency, or a currency that has a basket of different
basket-weighted
currencies. Yeah, but at that point, I think then there could be a vicious circle in which it feeds on itself. The dollar drops. If the Fed doesn't contract the money supply, what you'll get is an explosion upward of import prices. No more cheap shopping at Walmart. And you know, it's so precarious that a few years ago, there's evidence that now that drug dealers are beginning to offload their $100 bills. 80% of the $100 bills that are printed in the U.S. are not in the U.S. They're financing drug deals, they're hedging against inflation, and they're beginning to stop using them, and they're replacing them with 500 euro notes. So, I mean, that's just sort of the first step.
Mr. Chairman, forgive me, but should I worry about that?
I think we all should be, and should have been a long time ago.
Yeah, something about when the drug dealers have actually gone and attended their monetary economics classes, we're in trouble. But please, I interrupted.
No, that's what I was going to say.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman.